In The Lost Colony, John Harper shipwrecks on a cursed island, where he uncovers dark secrets, faces terrifying creatures, and ultimately sacrifices his soul to break an ancient curse, becoming the island's eternal guardian. Chapter 1: The Storm and the Wreck. The sky had been clear that morning, the sea calm, the breeze soft against the ship's sails. But by late afternoon, the horizon turned dark and foreboding, and the wind had shifted. The crew knew what was coming, but no one could have predicted how fast the storm would arrive, nor how violent it would become. As the clouds thickened and lightning split the sky, the sea swelled. Towering waves crashed against the ship, tossing it like a toy in the hands of a furious child. Thunder roared overhead, drowning out the frantic shouts of the crew. The ship's captain barked commands, but it was no use. The storm was too strong, the waves too high. They were powerless against the force of nature. John Harper, a young sailor on his first long voyage, clung to the rail as the deck tilted dangerously beneath his feet. The wind howled, pulling at his clothes and stinging his face with salt water. He'd heard stories of storms like this, but nothing could have prepared him for the raw terror he felt. He looked toward the captain, his heart pounding, but the man's face was a mask of fear. Even the seasoned sailors had lost their composure. They knew they were fighting a losing battle. "Brace yourselves," the captain yelled above the cacophony. His voice was swallowed by another deafening boom of thunder, and then the ship was struck by a massive wave. John's grip slipped, and he was thrown across the deck, crashing into the wooden railing on the opposite side. Pain shot through his ribs, but he had no time to recover. The ship groaned, the timbers cracking ominously as if the vessel itself was screaming. John barely had time to grab onto a rope before the ship tilted again, this time more violently. The storm had fully descended now, a swirling mass of chaos that consumed the ship whole. John could see nothing but walls of water on all sides. His vision blurred, his ears filled with the roar of wind and water. Suddenly, a sickening crack split. The air part of the mast was breaking loose. The massive wooden beam crashed down, shattering the deck where it fell, sending splinters flying in every direction. John scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He had to get to the lifeboats, if they hadn't already been smashed by the waves. He stumbled toward the side of the ship, clinging to whatever he could to keep from being swept overboard. The ship rocked again, and this time, John was thrown clear off the deck. For a brief moment, he felt weightless as he plunged into the icy Black Sea. Cold. The freezing water knocked the breath out of him as it closed over his head. He fought his way to the surface, gasping for air, only to be slammed by another wave. His arms flailed, trying to find something, anything to hold on to. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the storm. Finally, his hand closed around a piece of debris, a shattered plank from the ship. For what felt like hours, John drifted. The storm raged on, but he clung to the plank, fighting the exhaustion that was threatening to pull him under. He had lost sight of the sure pit was probably already beneath the waves by now. He was alone, surrounded by an endless, churning sea. Then, in the midst of the chaos, he saw it. Land. A jagged outline rose from the horizon, barely visible through the sheets of rain. The current pulled him closer, and John used what little strength he had left to kick toward it. As the waves continued to toss him about, he began to see more trees, rocks, a beach. Salvation. The next wave lifted him and hurled him toward the shore. He crashed into the shallows, gasping and sputtering, his body aching from the cold and the bruises. Crawling on hands and knees, he dragged himself up onto the sand, coughing up seawater as he collapsed, utterly spent. For a long time, John lay there, too exhausted to move. The rain still poured down, but the sound of the storm was fading. Slowly, he forced himself to sit up and looked around. The beach stretched out in either direction, desolate and unfamiliar. Dense jungle loomed beyond, dark and uninviting. He was alive. But where was he? John's mind raced with questions, but his body had no strength left for answers. He struggled to his feet, swaying unsteadily as he surveyed his surroundings. There was no sign of the ship, no wreckage on the shore, no other survivors. He was alone. The wind whispered through the trees, and for the first time since the storm began, there was silence. But as John took his first steps toward the jungle, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The island felt wrong. It wasn't just the eerie quiet after the storm. There was an oppressive weight in the air, something unseen yet undeniable. He stopped at the edge of the trees, staring into the shadows. The jungle seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the leaves shifting ever so slightly, as if in response to his presence. A cold dread settled over him. This island wasn't just desolate. It was haunted by something far worse than loneliness. The storm had delivered him here. But what awaited him in the heart of this island? As the last raindrops fell, John realized the true battle had only just begun. Chapter 2: The Vanished Colony. The morning sun rose sluggishly over the horizon, casting a pale light across the empty beach. John Harper woke to the sound of the waves lapping at the shore, his body aching from the previous night's ordeal. The storm was over, but the memories of it lingered cold, dark, and relentless. He could still feel the sea pulling him under, even though his feet were now on solid ground. He stood slowly, shaking off the exhaustion that clung to him like a heavy cloak. His first thought was survival. He needed to find food, water, and shelter before the sun sank again. And more than that, he needed answers. Where was he? What kind of island was this? The beach stretched out endlessly in both directions, but it was the dense jungle ahead that called to him. Something had pulled him toward it since he washed ashore, a strange sensation that there was more to this island than met the eye. Perhaps he wasn't alone. Perhaps there was a settlement, some form of civilization, where he could find help. With that slim hope burning in his chest, John made his way toward the dark line of trees that marked the jungle's edge. The jungle was oppressive, the air thick and humid, the silence broken only by the occasional call of distant birds. Every step he took felt heavier, the shadows seeming to reach for him, pulling him deeper into the unknown. It wasn't long before he noticed something barely visible through the tangled vines and underbrush a path. It was faint, overgrown with weeds and moss, but unmistakable. Someone had walked here before. John's heart quickened. He wasn't the first to set foot on this island. There must be others. He followed the path, pushing through the dense foliage, his pulse rising with every step. The jungle seemed to grow darker, even though the sun was climbing higher in the sky. The further he went, the stronger the sense of something off, something lurking just out of sight. It was as though the island was watching him, waiting for him to go just a little farther. The path led him to a clearing, and when he stepped into the light, his breath caught in his throat. There, before him, was the unmistakable outline of a small village, or what was left of one. It looked like a settlement, perhaps from years ago. Shabby huts with crumbling walls and broken rooftops stood in disrepair, overrun with vines and nature's slow reclaiming. The remains of what once might have been a thriving community now lay in eerie silence. The air was still, too still. Not even the wind moved through this place. John approached cautiously, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The village looked as though it had been abandoned in a hurry. Tools lay scattered across the ground, half-carved pieces of wood left where they had been worked on, as if their makers had dropped them and fled. Doors to the huts swung on rusted hinges, creaking in the quiet. A creeping unease settled into John's chest. Where were the people? What had happened here? He stepped closer to one of the huts and pushed open the door. Inside, the scene was no different. A small table, a few crude chairs, and a bed made of dried grass and leaves. There were bowls on the table, still filled with dust-covered remnants of food. Whoever had lived here had left suddenly, without time to pack or take their belongings. But why? John moved from one hut to the next, each revealing the same eerie evidence of an abrupt disappearance. Then, in one of the huts, something caught his eye: a leather-bound book, lying on a small shelf. It was worn and weathered, but intact. He picked it up, gently brushing away the dust, and opened it. It was a journal, The handwriting was neat but faded with time. The first few entries seemed mundane, describing the daily lives of the settlers building huts, fishing, gathering food. But as he flipped further through the pages, the tone changed. The entries grew shorter, more frantic. There is something in the jungle. We hear it at night. It watches us, but we cannot see it. John's heart raced as he read on. The entries continued, each one filled with increasing fear and paranoia. They're disappearing. One by one. We don't know who will be next. We can't fight it. We don't even know what it is. The final entry was smeared, as though written in a hurry. We tried the ritual. It didn't work. God help us. The last few words sent a chill down his spine. John closed the journal slowly, his mind racing. A ritual? What had these people been trying to ward off? He stood in the doorway of the hut, scanning the jungle that loomed just beyond the clearing. The silence pressed in on him again, heavy and suffocating. The jungle wasn't just thick with plants and trees, it was thick with secrets. Secrets the settlers had tried to confront and failed. John glanced around at the abandoned village, the scattered remnants of lives interrupted. Whatever had happened to these people, it had left no trace of them behind. There were no bodies, no signs of a struggle, only the eerie stillness that filled the air. And then, just as he was about to step back into the jungle, he saw it. A footprint. Fresh, pressed deep into the damp soil, leading away from the village and into the trees. John froze, his heart thudding in his chest. He wasn't alone. His mind raced. Who or what had left that footprint? Had someone survived? Or was something else watching him, just as it had watched the settlers all those years ago? Without a second thought, he moved back into the shadows of the jungle, his senses on high alert. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, made him tense. He followed the direction of the footprint, deeper into the jungle, his pulse quickening with each step. The air grew heavier, darker, as though the very trees were closing in around him. The silence became oppressive again, like a weight on his chest. Then, through the thick foliage, he spotted some fungus structure, hidden beneath layers of vines and moss. It was old, much older than the village he had just left. The stones were cracked and weathered, covered in ancient carvings. It was some kind of temple or shrine, built long before the settlers had arrived. John approached cautiously, his skin prickling with unease. The carvings on the stones were strange, unlike anything he had ever seen. Symbols that seemed to shift and change in the corner of his vision, almost as if they were alive. His eyes were drawn to the center of the shrine, where a large stone altar stood, stained dark with what looked like dried blood. The ritual. Whatever the settlers had tried to stop, this was where they had made their last stand. A sudden noise broke the silence. A faint rustling, somewhere behind him. John spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. The jungle seemed to close in on him, the shadows darker than before. He wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. Something was out there, lurking just beyond his sight. And it was getting closer. John backed away from the shrine, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. But the jungle was still. Too still. As he turned to leave, a whisper echoed through the trees, low and haunting. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't an animal. It was something else. Something that didn't belong. John ran. He didn't stop until he was back on the edge of the clearing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Whatever had happened to the settlers, it wasn't over. And whatever was watching him now, it wasn't human. The island held its secrets tightly, and John knew one thing for certain: those who tried to uncover them rarely survived. Chapter 3: Whispers in the Dark. The jungle had changed. As the sun began to set, long shadows crept across the ground, twisting the dense foliage into dark, ominous shapes. The air grew heavier, thick with humidity, and every sound seemed magnified: the rustling of leaves, the distant call of an unseen animal, the soft crackle of branches underfoot. It was as though the island itself had taken a breath, holding it in anticipation of what was to come. John Harper could feel it. That eerie, suffocating sensation that something was wrong. He had sensed it since discovering the abandoned village, but now, it felt stronger, like the island was awake, and it was watching him. He had retreated to the edge of the jungle as the last of the light faded, gathering wood for a fire. He couldn't risk staying in the village, not after what he'd found. The journal's final entry echoed in his mind, haunting him with its cryptic warning: "We tried the ritual. It didn't work. God help us." The thought of those words unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Whatever the settlers had feared, it was still here. It was still watching. As night fell, John worked quickly, striking flint against stone until the sparks caught, igniting the dry wood into a small but steady flame. The fire offered some comfort, its glow casting dancing shadows around him. But it didn't silence the unease that gnawed at the edges of his mind. The darkness beyond the firelight seemed impenetrable, alive with hidden threats. Sitting by the fire, John stared into the flames, trying to calm the racing thoughts in his head. But the jungle was far from quiet. Every creak, every snap of a twig, sent his heart racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was out there, moving just beyond the reach of the firelight. Hours passed, the night dragging on in a thick, suffocating silence. John's eyes grew heavy, and he fought the exhaustion threatening to pull him under. But just as his head began to nod, a sound broke through the quiet. A whisper. John's eyes snapped open, his body going rigid. He sat perfectly still, listening, his breath caught in his throat. The fire crackled softly, but the whisper had come from beyond it, from somewhere deep in the jungle. At first, it was faint, almost indiscernible, like the soft rustle of wind through leaves. But there was no wind. The air was still, heavy. The whisper came again, a low murmur that seemed to drift closer, carried on the breeze that didn't exist. John's pulse quickened. He scanned the darkness, straining to see anything beyond the flickering firelight, but the shadows were thick, hiding whatever lay beyond. He reached for the stick he had sharpened into a crude spear, his hand trembling. Again, the whisper. It was clearer now, like a voice, but not one he recognized. It wasn't human. The sound was too hollow, too strange, an otherworldly murmur that chilled him to the bone. It seemed to circle him, as if it were coming from all directions at once. John's mind raced. Was it the settlers? Had they returned as some sort of twisted spirits, bound to the island? Or was it something far older? Something that had lived here long before the settlers ever arrived? The whisper rose again, this time closer, more distinct. It was no longer a single voice but a chorus layered, overlapping, as though 100 voices were speaking at once. The words were incomprehensible, but the tone sent a cold shiver down his spine. There was malice in it, a sinister undertone that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. He stood up slowly, gripping his spear tighter, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The firelight seemed to shrink, its protective glow fading as the whispers grew louder. John's heart pounded in his chest, his breathing shallow and fast. And then he saw it. At the edge of the firelight, just beyond the reach of the flames, a figure moved slow, deliberate. It was barely visible, little more than a dark silhouette shifting between the trees. John's blood ran cold. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and moved with a fluid, almost ghostly grace. "Who's there?" John called out, his voice shaky but loud enough to carry through the jungle. The figure didn't respond, didn't stop. It just continued to glide through the shadows, keeping just out of reach, as if toying with him. John took a step back, his eyes locked on the figure. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. The whispering grew louder, the voices now swirling around him like a cyclone, filling his head with unintelligible sounds. Suddenly, the figure stopped. It stood motionless at the edge of the light, as if waiting for something. John's breath caught in his throat as the whispers ceased all at once, plunging the jungle into an eerie silence. Then, with agonizing slowness, the figure took a single step forward, into the light. John's eyes widened in horror. It wasn't human. The creature that emerged from the shadows was twisted and malformed, its body a grotesque mockery of a person. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, with patches of dark, decayed flesh clinging to its bones. Its eyes were hollow, deep-set voids that stared unblinkingly at him. The mouth was stretched into a grotesque grin, lips pulled back to reveal rows of sharp, jagged teeth. John stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. He had seen many things in his life, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. The creature took another step toward him, its movements unnaturally slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. "Stay back!" John shouted, raising his spear, though his voice betrayed the terror coursing through him. The creature stopped, tilting its head to one side, as though considering him, studying him. And then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar, it spoke. "You are not alone." John's blood turned to ice. Before he could react, the creature melted back into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The whispers returned, now louder and more frantic, swirling around him in a chaotic symphony of voices. John could feel the darkness pressing in on him, tightening like a noose around his throat. He had to get out of there. Without thinking, John turned and ran, his feet pounding against the ground as he sprinted through the jungle. The whispers followed, growing louder with each passing second, chasing him through the trees. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't stop running until he reached the clearing again, the abandoned village looming before him like a ghost from another life. The whispers were gone, the jungle silent once more, but the fear remained, clawing at his insides. John collapsed against the nearest hut, gasping for breath. He was drenched in sweat, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. And it wasn't alone. As he sat there, staring into the jungle's dark embrace, one thought echoed in his mind. The island wasn't just haunted by the past. Something far older and far more dangerous lurked in its depths. And now, it knew he was here. The whispers in the dark were only the beginning. Chapter 4, The Stranger. The dawn broke quietly over the jungle, a pale light filtering through the thick canopy, doing little to shake the unsettling weight that had settled on John Harper's shoulders. After the terrifying events of the previous night, whispers in the dark, the sight of the grotesque creature that stalked him, John had barely slept. His mind was a fog of fear and exhaustion. He had set out at first light, desperate to find water, food, anything that would keep him going as he tried to make sense of the island's mysteries. The trail that had led him deeper into the jungle the day before felt more dangerous now. The very trees around him somehow more menacing. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the jungle itself was alive and conscious of his every move. As John pushed through the dense underbrush, his senses heightened by fear, he became aware of something just ahead. At first, it was a flicker of movement, too quick to fully catch. He stopped, his heart pounding. He listened, nothing but the usual sounds of the jungle. Then, there it was again, a shape, a shadow darting between the trees. John tightened his grip on his spear, his pulse quickening. "Who's there?" he called out, trying to sound braver than he felt. No response. He inched forward, trying to stay low, trying not to make a sound. His breath caught in his throat as he peered into the shadows. Then he saw it, a figure. A man. The stranger emerged slowly from behind a tree, moving with a careful, deliberate step. He was a pitiful sight. His clothes were torn, hanging in dirty shreds, his face smeared with grime, his hair tangled and wild. He looked as if he had been on the island for years. John's grip on his spear faltered, his fear momentarily replaced by confusion. "Who are you?" he asked, lowering his weapon just slightly. "What are you doing here?" The man didn't answer right away. He stared at John for a long moment, his eyes wide, darting from side to side as though expecting something to leap from the shadows at any second. Then, in a voice that was hoarse and cracked, as if he hadn't spoken in days, he said, "You shouldn't be here." John blinked. "What do you mean?" How long have you been on this island? The man shook his head, his movements twitchy and nervous. Too long. Far too long. He took a step closer, and John noticed his trembling hands, clenched into tight fists as though trying to keep himself together. This place, it's cursed. No one should be here. John's stomach churned at the word. Cursed. It echoed the cryptic words he had read in the settler's journal, the warning that whatever the colonists had unleashed couldn't be stopped. You were with the colony, weren't you? John asked, stepping closer. What happened to them? What happened to the people here? The man's face twisted in agony, his eyes suddenly wild with fear. Gone, he whispered. All of them, gone. The jungle took them. It takes everything. John felt a cold shiver run down his spine. What do you mean, the jungle took them? Did something attack the colony? The man let out a hollow laugh, his voice cracked and broken. Attack? No. No, it doesn't need to attack. It's all around us, waiting, watching. It's inside the trees, inside the ground, inside our minds. It whispers to you, until you can't hear anything else. Until it has you. John's heart pounded as the stranger's words sank in. The whispers, he muttered to himself, remembering the eerie voices that had surrounded him the night before. I heard them. Last night. The man's eyes widened with terror. You've already heard them? Then it's too late. It started with you. John felt panic rising in his chest. Started? What are you talking about? The stranger's voice dropped to a frantic whisper. The jungle is alive. The settlers, my people, they thought they could tame it, build their lives here. But they didn't know what they were waking up. They disturbed something old, something ancient and angry. And now it wants us all. John's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the story. The settlers had built their village here, lived their lives, but they had done something to anger the island. They had awakened something, perhaps the same dark force he had glimpsed the night before. I don't understand, John said, frustration bubbling up. If this place is so dangerous, how have you survived? The man looked at him with hollow eyes, filled with despair. Survive? He scoffed. I didn't survive. I just didn't die, not yet. But I'm not alive, not really. This place, it takes everything from you, little by little. First your hope, then your sanity. And in the end, it takes your soul. John's throat went dry. The man wasn't just talking about survival, he was talking about something far worse. Something that ate away at you from the inside, turning you into one of the monsters he had seen. Is there a way off this island? John asked, his voice barely steady. The man shook his head slowly, hopelessness etched into every line of his face. You can't leave. It won't let you. It keeps you here, trapped. Like a prison with no walls. You can try to run, but the island will always pull you back. John's stomach twisted with fear. He had survived the storm, washed ashore on this cursed place, but now it seemed there was no escape. The island didn't just trap its victims physically, it bound them to itself, like prisoners in a nightmare. There has to be something we can do, John said, desperation rising in his voice. The settlers, they tried something, didn't they? A ritual? The man's expression darkened. The ritual, he whispered, his voice full of dread. Yes, they tried. They thought they could make it stop. They believed if they offered enough, sacrificed enough, it would let them go. But it didn't. It only made things worse. John frowned, remembering the blood-stained altar he had seen in the jungle. What was the ritual for? What were they trying to stop? The man's gaze flickered with fear. The island's hunger. The dark force that lives here, beneath the trees. It feeds on us, on our fear, our souls. They thought the ritual could appease it, but they were wrong. It only made the island angrier. And now it's stronger than ever. John felt the weight of hopelessness settle over him like a suffocating blanket. The settlers had failed. Whatever dark force ruled the island was too powerful, too malevolent to be stopped. And now it had its sights set on him. But there must be a way, John pressed, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. There has to be something we can do. The man's eyes met his, filled with a flicker of something, perhaps a sliver of hope, or maybe it was just desperation. There is one thing, he said quietly, stepping closer. Something the settlers never tried. Something they were too afraid to do. John leaned in, his pulse quickening. What is it? The man glanced over his shoulder, as if expecting something to burst from the jungle at any moment. You have to go to the heart of the island, he whispered. Where the whispers are strongest. Where the darkness is thickest. That's where the power is. If you can find it, if you can confront it, maybe, just maybe, you can end this. John's stomach churned. The heart of the island. The thought filled him with dread. But it was the only lead he had. How do I find it? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man looked at him with weary eyes. It will find you, he said softly. It always does. John stood in stunned silence as the man turned and disappeared back into the jungle, his figure swallowed by the shadows. The wind stirred the leaves, carrying with it the faintest echo of those haunting whispers. John knew what he had to do. But he also knew that whatever awaited him at the heart of the island was far more terrifying than anything he had faced before. The island wanted him to come. And it would stop at nothing to keep him there. Chapter 5, The Forbidden Cave. The jungle seemed to breathe around him as John Harper ventured deeper into its dark heart. Every step felt heavier, as though the island itself was resisting his progress, trying to pull him back. The stranger's words echoed in his mind, go to the heart of the island, where the whispers are strongest. But what truly haunted John was the man's cryptic warning, it will find you. It always does. John wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew he couldn't stay in the village any longer. There was something more sinister at play, something ancient and powerful that the settlers had disturbed. And the answer to it all seemed to lie in the depths of the jungle. After hours of trekking through thick, overgrown paths, John began to notice subtle changes in his surroundings. The trees were different here, taller and older. Their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal hands reaching out from the earth. Vines hung low, dripping with moss, and the air felt thick, almost oppressive. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper, darker, as though they were hiding something. John pushed forward, his senses on high alert. The sun had begun to sink behind the horizon, casting the jungle in long, eerie shadows. Night would soon fall, and the island's true horrors always seemed to come alive after dark. He quickened his pace, scanning the jungle for any sign of this heart the stranger had mentioned. Then, just as the last light of day began to fade, he saw it, a large, dark opening hidden beneath a canopy of vines and thick foliage. The entrance to a cave. John's pulse quickened. This had to be it, the place where the settlers had performed their desperate ritual. The place where the whispers came from. The forbidden cave. The air around the entrance was colder, unnaturally so. A faint, almost imperceptible breeze seemed to seep from the cave, carrying with it a damp, musty smell. John hesitated for a moment, gripping his spear tightly. Every instinct told him to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But the pull of the island was too strong. He needed answers. He needed to know what had happened here and if there was any chance of escape. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The cave swallowed him whole, the darkness pressing in from all sides. John's footsteps echoed off the walls as he ventured deeper, his only source of light the weak glow of a makeshift torch he had fashioned from a bundle of sticks. The flames flickered, casting eerie shadows on the rough stone walls. The deeper he went, the more suffocating the air became, thick with an ancient, almost tangible presence. And then, faintly at first, he heard them again, the whispers. They started as soft murmurs, distant and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. But as John descended further into the cave, they grew louder, clearer. The voices overlapped, a chaotic chorus of murmurs, none of which he could understand. But the tone was unmistakable despair, anger, and something darker still. It was as though the very walls of the cave were alive, whispering their secrets to anyone who dared to listen. John's skin prickled with unease. The settlers had come here, to this very cave, searching for salvation. But instead of peace, they had found madness. He could feel it now, pressing in on him like an invisible force, tugging at the edges of his mind. The whispers grew louder still, surrounding him, filling the cave with their eerie song. Then, suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way. John's foot slipped on loose gravel, and he tumbled forward, crashing down a steep slope and landing hard on his side. His torch rolled out of his hand, the flames flickering wildly before being snuffed out by the damp air. Darkness enveloped him. He groaned, clutching his side as he pushed himself up onto his knees. Pain radiated through his body, but he was alive. His heart pounded in his chest, his breathing rapid and shallow. The whispers were louder now, filling his head, pressing against his skull until it felt like his mind might shatter. Blindly, John reached out for his torch, his fingers brushing against the rough stone floor. After what felt like an eternity, he found it and managed to strike flint against the wood. The flames flickered back to life, casting a faint, shaky light around him. And that's when he saw it. The chamber he had fallen into was massive, far larger than he had imagined. The walls were covered in strange, intricate carvings, symbols that twisted and shifted in the torchlight, as though they were alive. At the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, old and weathered, but unmistakable. Dark stains marred its surface, dried blood. John's breath caught in his throat. This was the site of the settlers' ritual. The altar where they had tried and failed to appease whatever dark force ruled this island. He moved closer to the altar, his footsteps hesitant. The air around it was colder than the rest of the cave. And the whispers were deafening here, as though they were being drawn toward the altar, converging in a single point. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse, their meaning just beyond his comprehension. As if they were trying to tell him something. As John reached the altar, he noticed something strange, a large, weathered stone tablet resting against its base. It was covered in more of the strange symbols. But unlike the carvings on the walls, these seemed different. They were more orderly, more deliberate, as though they were instructions. John knelt down, running his fingers over the tablet. The stone was cold, smooth to the touch. And then, as his fingers traced the symbols, the whispers shifted. For the first time, he understood a word. Sacrifice. John recoiled, pulling his hand back as though the stone had burned him. The whispers surged, louder now, more insistent. Sacrifice, sacrifice, sacrifice. The word echoed in his mind, reverberating off the walls of the chamber, filling the space with a terrible energy. His heart raced as the weight of it settled over him. The settlers had come here, desperate to lift the curse of the island. They had performed the ritual, following these instructions carved into the stone tablet. But they had failed. John could see that now whatever dark force they had tried to appease hadn't accepted their offering. And now, it demanded more. The whispers grew frenzied, swirling around him like a storm, their voices harsh and guttural. John stumbled back, clutching his head as the voices pounded against his mind. They weren't just calling for a sacrifice, they were calling for him. The island wanted him. Panic surged through him, and he spun around, his torch casting wild shadows across the walls. He had to get out. He had to leave this place before the whispers consumed him completely. He stumbled toward the entrance of the cave, his vision swimming, the voices rising to a deafening crescendo. But as he neared the mouth of the cave, something stopped him. A figure stood at the entrance, silhouetted against the fading light outside. It was tall, thin, its form twisted and unnatural. Just like the creature he had seen the night before. Its eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to pull him in, and its mouth was stretched into that same grotesque grin. John froze, his breath catching in his throat. The whispers fell silent, and for a moment, there was only the sound of his own heartbeat thudding in his ears. The creature took a step forward, its movements slow, deliberate. And then it spoke, its voice a hollow echo of the whispers. "You are the sacrifice." John's blood ran cold. He turned and ran, his torch flickering as he plunged back into the darkness of the cave. He didn't stop to think, didn't look back. He just ran, his feet slipping on the wet stone as he scrambled up the slope and out of the chamber. The creature's voice followed him, growing fainter but no less chilling. "You cannot run? You are already mine." John's breath came in ragged gasps as he finally burst out of the cave and into the jungle. The sunlight had faded completely now, and the jungle was bathed in the deep shadows of twilight. But even as he ran, the words echoed in his mind. "You are the sacrifice." The island had chosen him. And there was no escaping it. Chapter 6: Shadows of the Past. John Harper ran through the jungle as if the very island itself were chasing him, branches tearing at his clothes, vines trying to trip him with every step. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his heart thundered in his chest. Behind him, the cave and its horrific secret loomed, but he knew he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the island had made its intentions clear it wanted him as the next sacrifice. He burst into a small clearing, collapsing against a tree as he tried to catch his breath. The whispers had faded for now, replaced by the deafening sound of his own pulse in his ears. But even in the silence, John couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling of dread that had settled over him. The island had marked him. As he rested, his mind raced with the pieces of the puzzle he had gathered so far: the abandoned village, the blood-stained altar in the cave, and the warnings from the stranger. It all pointed to one terrifying conclusion: the island was alive, and it demanded sacrifices to maintain its power. The settlers had tried to appease it, but their ritual had failed. Now, it wanted John. But why? Why had the island chosen him? John's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of movement in the jungle. He tensed, gripping the spear he had fashioned from a sturdy branch. His eyes darted through the shadows, searching for any sign of the creature that had spoken to him in the cave. But it wasn't the creature. A figure emerged from the trees, moving slowly, cautiously. It was the stranger, the man who had warned him about the island's dark power. He looked even more disheveled now, his eyes wide with fear as he approached. "You found it, didn't you?" the stranger whispered, his voice trembling. "The cave, the altar." John nodded, still catching his breath. "I found it. But it wasn't just a cave. There's something else, something ancient. It's alive, and it wants blood." The stranger's face twisted into a grimace, and he shook his head. "I told you, didn't I? The island, it takes everything. It took the settlers, just like it's going to take you." John swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Why me? What did I do?" The stranger stepped closer, his gaze intense. "It's not about what you did. It's about what the island needs. It doesn't care who you are, it only cares that you're here. The moment you set foot on this cursed land, it marked you." John's stomach turned. But the settlers, what happened to them? Why didn't the ritual work? The stranger's eyes darkened, and he hesitated before answering. "Because the island doesn't want just any sacrifice. It wants something more. Something pure." John felt a cold chill creep up his spine. "What are you talking about?" The stranger looked down at the ground, his voice barely above a whisper. "The settlers tried to fight it. They thought they could bargain with the island, but they were wrong. They didn't understand what it wanted, not fully. They tried to use blood, to sacrifice animals and offerings, but it wasn't enough. The island, it wants more than that. It wants your soul." John's pulse quickened as the weight of the stranger's words sank in. The island hadn't just claimed the settlers' lives, it had claimed their very essence, turning them into something else. The creatures he had seen, the twisted, grotesque figures, they were what remained of the settlers, their souls bound to the island for eternity. John took a step back, his mind reeling. "And now it's trying to do the same to me." The stranger nodded slowly. "You've seen them, haven't you? The shadows, the ones who came before you. The island consumed them, just like it will consume you. Unless..." John's breath caught in his throat. "Unless what?" The stranger's gaze flickered with a faint glimmer of hope. "There's still a way. A way to end this." But it's dangerous, more dangerous than anything you've faced so far. John felt a surge of desperation. Tell me. The stranger hesitated for a moment before speaking. There's a place, deep in the jungle. A place the settlers never found, but I did. It's older than the island itself, older than the cave or the altar. It's where the island's power is strongest, its heart. If you can get there, if you can face it, you might be able to break the cycle. John's mind raced. The heart of the island. The place where it all began. It was the only chance he had, but it sounded impossible. And how do I find it? The stranger's expression grew solemn. You don't find it. It finds you. John's heart sank. It was the same thing the stranger had said before, the same cryptic warning. But this time, there was no avoiding it. The island was pulling him toward its heart, whether he wanted to go or not. The stranger took a step closer, lowering his voice. Listen to me, Harper. The shadows, they'll try to stop you. They'll do everything they can to keep you from reaching the heart. They want you to become one of them. But you can't let them take you. John swallowed hard, fear gnawing at the edges of his mind. What do I do when I get there? How do I stop it? The stranger's eyes darkened. You'll know. When you're there, you'll feel it. But you have to be prepared. The island will fight back. It won't let go easily. John nodded, his jaw set in determination. I have no choice, do I? The stranger shook his head slowly. None of us do. A heavy silence fell between them, the weight of the island's dark history pressing down on them both. John's mind was a whirlwind of fear and uncertainty, but beneath it all, there was a flicker of resolve. He wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The stranger began to back away, disappearing into the shadows once more. If you survive, if you reach the heart, maybe, just maybe, you can break the curse. But no one's ever made it that far. John watched as the stranger vanished into the jungle, his presence fading like a ghost of the past. The whispers had returned, faint but ever present, echoing through the trees. The island was watching, waiting. John took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. The heart of the island, the source of its power, the key to breaking the curse. It was the only way out. But he knew the journey would be perilous, and the island would throw every horror it had at him to stop him. The shadows of the past were all around him now, their presence thick and suffocating. He could feel their eyes on him, watching his every move, waiting for him to fall into their grasp. But John wasn't ready to become one of them. Not yet. With a final glance toward the fading light, John set off into the jungle, deeper than he had ever gone before. The path ahead was unknown, but he knew one thing for certain: he was no longer just fighting for his life. He was fighting for his soul. And the island was about to show him just how far it would go to take it. Chapter 7: The Unseen Enemy. The jungle had become a living maze, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic, as if the island itself was shifting to trap John Harper in its depths. The further he went, the more the trees seemed to close in around him, their branches like skeletal arms reaching out, their roots tangling beneath his feet. The thick canopy above swallowed the light, casting everything in a muted greenish gloom. But the most unnerving part wasn't the oppressive darkness or the suffocating heat. It was the feeling that he wasn't alone. For hours, John had pushed deeper into the heart of the island, following a vague sense of direction he couldn't quite explain. The whispers had returned, faint at first but now growing louder with every step. They seemed to be guiding him, luring him forward, as if the island wanted him to keep going. And yet, something else was out there too, something he couldn't see but could feel. He hadn't seen the creature since the cave, but the sense of being watched had never left him. The jungle was hiding more than just trees and shadows. John stopped, his muscles tense, listening. The jungle was unnaturally quiet now, as if it were holding its breath. The usual rustle of leaves and distant calls of birds were gone. It was the kind of silence that sent a chill up his spine, a silence that screamed of danger. Then, from somewhere just beyond the line of trees, there was a soft sound, the faintest crack of a twig snapping underfoot. John spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. His eyes darted through the underbrush, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Only trees, vines, and shadows. His grip tightened around the spear in his hand, his knuckles white. He wasn't alone, he was sure of it now. For a long moment, he stood perfectly still, listening. His breath was shallow, his pulse thudding in his ears. Then, there it was again, the sound of movement, closer this time. Something was stalking him. Moving silently through the jungle, staying just out of sight. John's mind raced. Was it one of the creatures from the cave? One of the settlers who had been consumed by the island, now twisted into something monstrous? Or was it something else, something even older and darker? He slowly backed away, keeping his eyes on the trees. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he knew better. Whatever was out there, it was hunting him. Running would only make him an easier target. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a flicker of movement. A shadow darting between the trees, barely visible, almost as if it were part of the jungle itself. John's breath caught in his throat. The figure was human-shaped but distorted, its limbs too long, its movements too fluid. It moved like a predator, slipping between the trees with an unnatural grace, its eyes hidden in the gloom. He took another step back, his heart pounding. The whispers in his head grew louder, swirling in chaotic patterns, urging him to run, to flee, to give in to the island's power. But he couldn't run. Not yet. Instead, he crouched low, trying to make himself as small as possible, his spear held tightly in front of him. He scanned the jungle, watching for any sign of the creature. But it was too fast, too clever. It moved in and out of the shadows like a ghost, always just beyond his reach. Suddenly, there was a rush of movement behind him. John spun around just in time to see another figure dart between the trees, circling him. His pulse quickened. There wasn't just one of them, there were many. The unseen enemy was closing in. John's mind raced. He couldn't fight them, not like this. He had to find a way out, some kind of escape. But the jungle was a maze, and every direction looked the same: dense trees and tangled vines, no clear path. His only hope was to keep moving, to stay one step ahead of whatever was hunting him. He stood slowly, every muscle in his body tense. He could hear the creatures now, the soft rustle of leaves, the occasional crack of a branch. They were all around him, closing the circle tighter and tighter. Taking a deep breath, John bolted. He sprinted through the jungle, leaping over roots and ducking under low-hanging branches, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The ground was uneven, and more than once he stumbled, nearly falling as he raced through the thick underbrush. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The whispers in his mind grew louder, the voices of the island urging him onward, pushing him deeper into its heart. Behind him, the creatures gave chase. He could hear them now, their footsteps barely more than a whisper, but fast, too fast. They moved through the jungle like shadows, their presence almost invisible but unmistakable. John's heart pounded in his chest as he ran, the fear driving him forward. Up ahead, the trees thinned slightly, and John saw a break in the jungle, a clearing. He pushed himself harder, sprinting toward the opening, desperate for a moment of reprieve. He burst into the clearing, skidding to a stop. His eyes widened in horror. The clearing wasn't empty. It was filled with the remnants of old, crumbling structures: stone pillars and broken walls, overgrown with moss and vines. It looked ancient, far older than the settlers' village. In the center stood a large stone structure, half buried in the earth, its surface covered in the same strange symbols John had seen in the cave. And at the base of the structure lay something else. A pile of bones. John's stomach churned as he stared at the skeletal remains, scattered and broken. The bones were old, bleached by the sun, but there were too many of them, far too many for this to be just one or two people. This was a graveyard, a place where the island had claimed its victims and left them to rot. The whispers in his mind grew louder, more insistent. The island was speaking to him, showing him what would happen if he stayed. If he didn't find a way to stop it, he would end up like them, just another pile of bones, consumed by the island's hunger. John backed away from the pile, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He could still hear the creatures in the jungle, moving closer, their presence pressing in on him from all sides. He was trapped. Then, without warning, the jungle erupted into chaos. The creatures burst from the trees, their shadowy forms moving with terrifying speed. John barely had time to raise his spear before they were upon him. He swung wildly, trying to keep them at bay, but they were too fast. One of them lunged at him, its long, twisted limbs reaching for him. John stabbed at it with his spear, but the creature dodged, circling him like a predator stalking its prey. He was outnumbered, surrounded on all sides. The creatures moved in and out of the shadows, their grotesque forms barely visible in the dim light. They didn't attack directly, but they didn't need to. They were toying with him, wearing him down, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. John's mind raced. He couldn't fight them all. He couldn't outrun them. His only chance was to use the terrain. Maybe he could find cover among the ruins, use the broken walls to slow them down. He backed toward the stone structure, his eyes darting between the creatures as they closed in. The whispers in his mind grew louder, more frantic, filling his head with chaotic, jumbled thoughts. The island was pressing against his mind, trying to break him. But he wouldn't let it. Not yet. With a burst of energy, John turned and sprinted toward the stone structure. The creatures gave chase, their inhuman screeches filling the air as they leaped after him. He scrambled up the crumbling stone, pulling himself onto a narrow ledge just as one of the creatures lunged at him, its sharp claws swiping through the air where his legs had been seconds before. John clambered higher, finding footholds in the ancient stone. The creatures snarled below, their eyes glowing in the dim light as they circled the base of the structure. They couldn't climb, not yet, but John knew it was only a matter of time before they found a way to reach him. His breath came in ragged gasps as he reached the top of the structure. From here, he could see the entire clearing and the creatures below, still circling like wolves around prey. The whispers in his mind were deafening now, their voices screaming for him to give up, to surrender to the island's power. But John wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. As he crouched on top of the ancient structure, his eyes scanned the jungle for an escape route. There had to be a way out, some path that would take him deeper into the island, closer to its heart. He had come too far to stop now. And then he saw a narrow path, hidden behind a wall of vines, leading deeper into the jungle. It was barely visible, but it was there. His only chance. With one final glance at the creatures below, John took a deep breath and jumped from the structure, landing hard on the ground. Pain shot through his leg, but he forced himself to run, pushing through the vines and into the hidden path. The creatures screeched in frustration behind him, but John didn't look back. He ran deeper into the island. Chapter 8, The Mark of the Cursed. The path ahead twisted and turned like a serpent, winding through the thick jungle as John Harper ran, his legs aching from exhaustion and his lungs burning with every breath. The creatures' screeches faded behind him, but he knew they were still out there watching, waiting for their chance to strike. His escape was only temporary. The island wouldn't let him go that easily. The hidden path seemed to pull him deeper into the heart of the island, the jungle closing in around him with each step. The air grew thicker, the oppressive humidity pressing down on him like a weight, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They echoed in his mind, not just from the jungle around him, but from within, as if they were coming from the very core of his being. John pushed forward, trying to block out the voices. He needed to focus. There had to be a way to break this curse, to stop whatever ancient power had claimed this island. The stranger had spoken of the island's heart, of a place where its dark energy was strongest. If he could find it, maybe, just maybe, he could free himself from its grip. But with every step, something else gnawed at him. A sensation, a slow creeping dread, that something inside him had changed. He stopped for a moment, panting, and leaned against a tree to catch his breath. His heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline from the chase finally ebbing. He wiped the sweat from his brow and felt a strange tingling sensation on his skin, like tiny needles pricking at his flesh. His arms, his legs, something was wrong. John slowly rolled up his sleeve, his breath catching in his throat as his eyes widened in horror. A dark mark had appeared on his forearm. It spread in an intricate pattern, like black veins twisting under his skin, forming a symbol that pulsed faintly with a sickly glow. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before, an unnatural mark, etched into his flesh as if by an invisible hand. His mind raced. The mark of the cursed. He had heard of it before, from stories passed down among sailors and explorers, tales of those who had ventured too far into places they weren't meant to go, places where ancient forces still held sway. They spoke of the cursed mark, a symbol of doom, a sign that the person who bore it had been claimed by something dark and terrible. But those were just legends, weren't they? John stared at the mark, his mind spinning. Was this what had happened to the settlers? Had they too been marked by the island, chosen to be consumed by its power? Was this why they had disappeared, their souls bound to this cursed place? A wave of nausea washed over him as he realized the full gravity of his situation. He wasn't just being hunted by the creatures in the jungle. He was becoming one of them. The island had claimed him, and now it was working its way into his very being, turning him into something else, something monstrous. Panic surged through him. He had to stop it, had to find a way to reverse this before it was too late. But how? How could he fight an island, a force that seemed to exist beyond the natural world? The whispers grew louder, swirling in his mind, feeding on his fear, driving him deeper into despair. "You are already mine," the creature had said in the cave. John clenched his fists, fighting back the panic that threatened to overwhelm him. No. He wouldn't let the island take him, not without a fight. He still had a chance if he could reach the heart of the island. Maybe there was a way to break the curse, to rid himself of this mark. He forced himself to move, pushing away from the tree and continuing down the path. Every step felt heavier now, as if the jungle itself was trying to drag him down, to claim him. The mark on his arm throbbed with every beat of his heart, a constant reminder of the curse that was slowly consuming him. The path led him deeper into a part of the island he had never seen before. The trees were older here, their bark twisted and gnarled, their roots forming thick, tangled webs across the ground. The air was cooler, but the shadows seemed darker, more oppressive, as if the very light was being swallowed by the island's ancient power. And then he saw it. Ahead, the jungle opened up into a massive clearing, dominated by a towering stone monolith that stood like a sentinel at the center. The structure was ancient, weathered by centuries of wind and rain, its surface covered in the same strange symbols John had seen in the cave and on the altar. But this was different. The energy that radiated from the monolith was overwhelming, a dark pulse that vibrated through the ground, through the air, through John's very bones. He could feel that this was the heart of the island. The whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices that filled his mind, urging him forward. The mark on his arm burned now, as if reacting to the monolith, drawing him closer. His body moved on its own, compelled by a force he could no longer resist. As he approached the stone, he saw something else, a figure, kneeling at the base of the monolith. John froze, his heart racing. It was the stranger. The man was hunched over, his body shaking as he muttered incoherently to himself. His clothes were in tatters, his hair wild, and his skin was pale, covered in the same black veins that now marked John's own flesh. The stranger's eyes were wide with terror as he looked up at the stone, as if he had been drawn there by the same force that now pulled John forward. John hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, to run. But he couldn't. The island had brought him here for a reason, and the only way out was through. "Harper." The stranger's voice was a weak rasp, barely audible over the whispers. You've come." John took a step closer, his hand gripping the spear at his side. What is this place? What's happening to me? The stranger looked up at him, his eyes filled with sorrow. The mark. It's the island's claim on you. You've been chosen, just like the settlers were. We're all part of its cycle now. John shook his head, his chest tightening. No. There has to be a way to stop this. The stranger let out a hollow laugh, his voice tinged with madness. Stop it? There's no stopping it. The island, it consumes everything. It's too powerful. We're just fuel for its hunger. John stepped forward, his pulse quickening. There has to be a way. Something the settlers missed. You said they never reached the heart of the island. The stranger's eyes flickered with a faint glimmer of hope before dimming again. I thought this was it. I thought if I reached the heart, I could break the curse. But it's too late. The island, it's already inside us. John's mind raced. He looked up at the monolith, its dark surface pulsing with energy. He could feel the island's power radiating from it, but there was something more, something hidden beneath the surface, a deeper secret that the settlers had never discovered. He stepped closer to the monolith, his fingers brushing against the cold stone. He stepped closer to the monolith, his fingers brushing against the cold stone. The mark on his arm flared with pain, but he ignored it, focusing on the symbols carved into the stone. They seemed to shift and move beneath his touch, alive with the island's dark magic. And then, in a flash of clarity, he understood. The settlers had been wrong. The ritual wasn't about blood or sacrifices. It was about power, about control. The island didn't just want to consume them, it wanted them to submit, to surrender their will to its dark influence. But there was a way to resist. John stepped back, his mind racing. The settlers had failed because they had fought against the island, tried to appease it through fear. But what if the key wasn't fear, but defiance? What if the only way to break the curse was to reject the island's power entirely? The stranger looked up at him, his eyes hollow. What are you doing? John tightened his grip on the spear, his heart pounding. I'm ending this. Before the stranger could respond, John turned and drove the spear into the heart of the monolith, the sharp tip sinking deep into the stone. The ground shook violently, and a deafening roar erupted from the jungle as the island's power surged around them. The mark on John's arm flared with unbearable heat, but he held firm, his mind clear. He wouldn't let the island take him. Not like this. With one final surge of energy, the monolith cracked, and a blinding light erupted from within. And then, everything went still. The whispers fell silent. The jungle was quiet. John stumbled back, his body weak, but the mark on his arm was fading, its dark veins receding into his skin. The curse had been broken. The island was free. Chapter 9, The Sacrifice. John Harper staggered back from the shattered monolith, his legs trembling beneath him as the deafening silence settled over the jungle. The once oppressive hum of the island's dark power had dissipated, and the ever-present whispers had vanished. As if they had been swallowed by the earth itself. The light that had burst from the heart of the monolith still lingered in the air, casting long shadows across the ancient clearing, but the island felt different now, quiet, almost peaceful. But John knew better. The battle was far from over. His chest heaved with every breath, his heart still racing from the exertion of what he had just done. His arm, the one bearing the cursed mark, still throbbed with a dull pain, though the black veins that had once spread across his skin were slowly receding. He wasn't free yet. Not truly. Behind him, the stranger remained on his knees, his eyes wide with disbelief as he stared at the cracked remains of the monolith. You shattered it, he whispered, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and wonder. But the curse, it's still here. John glanced down at the fading mark on his arm, then at the monolith. The island had weakened, he could feel that much, but the curse had not been lifted completely. Something was still holding it together, keeping the dark magic alive. There's something more, John said quietly, more to himself than to the stranger. The island's not done with us. The stranger lifted his head, his face a mask of confusion and desperation. What more could it want? We've done everything, tried everything, there's nothing left. John turned back to the monolith, studying its surface. The cracks that had formed after his strike spread like a web across the ancient stone, revealing an inner core that pulsed with a dim, red glow. It wasn't just a structure, it was alive. And it was still feeding off the energy of the island. Whatever ancient force had taken root here, it was still clinging to life, still demanding something. Sacrifice. John's mind raced. The settlers had tried to satisfy the island with blood, with rituals and offerings, but it had never been enough. They hadn't understood what the island truly craved, what it had been built to protect for centuries. It wasn't just the people's lives it wanted, it was their souls. The island didn't need a sacrifice of flesh. It needed something deeper. John's stomach churned as the realization struck him. The island needed someone to willingly give themselves to it. To become the final piece of the curse that bound this place to darkness. And the only way to free everyone else, the settlers, the stranger, and himself, was for one of them to make that ultimate choice. The sacrifice had to be willing. He turned slowly to face the stranger, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was about to say. It needs a true sacrifice. One of us. The stranger's face paled, his eyes wide with horror. No, we've been through too much. You shattered the monolith. That should be enough. John shook his head, his heart sinking. The island's still holding on. The curse is still here, and it's feeding off this place, off us. The only way to break it for good is for someone to give themselves willingly. The settlers never understood that. The stranger recoiled, shaking his head violently. No, I won't do it. I can't. I've spent years trying to survive this place. I can't just give myself to it now. John understood his fear, he felt it too. The thought of willingly giving himself to the island, of surrendering his very soul to whatever dark power had ruled here for centuries, was terrifying. But he had seen enough to know that there was no other way out. The island wouldn't stop until it had claimed its prize. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. The whispers may have gone silent. But the weight of the island's presence still lingered in the air, a constant pressure in the back of his mind. It was waiting for him to make the choice. John took a step forward, his eyes fixed on the glowing core of the monolith. The cracks in its surface pulsed faintly, the light within it flickering as though the island itself was growing impatient. I'll do it, John said, his voice steady. The stranger looked up at him in shock. What? No. You don't have to. There has to be another way, there always is. John shook his head. We both know there isn't. I don't want to die here any more than you do, but I can't live with the thought of leaving this place behind, knowing it will keep claiming more souls, more lives. The island has to be stopped. The stranger stared at him, his eyes filled with a mix of disbelief and desperation. You don't have to do this. John met his gaze, his own resolve hardening. If I don't, this curse will never end. More people will come, more will be lost, and the island will never let them go. It has to stop here. Now. The stranger's face twisted with emotion, but he didn't argue. He knew the truth, as much as it pained him to admit it. John turned back to the monolith and stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The air around the ancient stone was thick with tension, as though the island itself was holding its breath, waiting for the final act. The closer John got, the more the mark on his arm burned, but he didn't stop. He had made his decision. As he stood before the glowing core, the whispers returned, soft at first, but growing louder, filling his mind with words he couldn't fully understand. They were urging him on, welcoming him, accepting his choice. John raised his hand, the cursed mark pulsing with dark energy. His skin tingled as he touched the surface of the monolith, the stone warm and alive beneath his fingers. The whispers surged, wrapping around him like a cloak, as if the island itself was pulling him closer. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the island's presence pressing down on him. This was it. The final sacrifice. I give myself willingly, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the roaring in his mind. Let this end. The moment the words left his lips, the ground trembled. A violent surge of energy erupted from the monolith, and John was thrown back, his body hitting the earth with a heavy thud. His vision blurred, the world spinning as the jungle seemed to shake with the force of the island's response. The whispers grew deafening, swirling around him in a chaotic storm, but they no longer felt hostile. They were grateful. John lay on the ground, gasping for breath as the energy coursed through him. The mark on his arm burned with an unbearable heat, and he cried out in pain, clutching his arm as the black veins pulsed wildly. His body convulsed, the energy of the island flooding through him, as though it were tearing him apart from the inside. But then, as quickly as it began, the pain stopped. John lay still, his body trembling as the heat faded, leaving only a dull ache in its wake. He opened his eyes slowly, his vision clearing just in time to see the monolith crack one final time. The stone shattered, crumbling into dust, and the red glow flickered out, leaving the clearing bathed in the soft light of the setting sun. The island had accepted the sacrifice. John slowly sat up, his breath ragged. The mark on his arm was gone, the cursed veins completely vanished, as though they had never been there. The air around him was still, peaceful. And for the first time since he had arrived, the island felt calm. He looked over at the stranger, who stared at him in stunned silence, his face a mixture of relief and sorrow. The curse had been broken. But John knew the price he had paid. The island had taken his soul. As he stood, he felt a strange detachment wash over him. He was free of the curse, but he no longer felt like himself. The island had claimed him, not as a monster or a twisted creature, but as something else, something beyond life and death. He had given himself to the island, and in return, it had given him peace. But he would never leave. John turned and walked back into the jungle, his footsteps silent as he disappeared into the shadows. The island had claimed him, and now, he would remain a part of it forever. The sacrifice was complete. Chapter 10, The Final Revelation. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the island, but John Harper no longer felt the warmth of its light. As he moved through the jungle, the world around him seemed distant, muted. The whispers were gone, the weight of the island's dark presence lifted, yet John felt a hollowness within him, as if something essential had been taken. He had broken the curse. The monolith had shattered, the island's grip over the settlers and everyone else who had ever set foot here had been loosened. But the sacrifice, the willing surrender of his soul, had come with a price. John felt it in every step, in the strange detachment that now colored his every thought. He was no longer truly alive. The island had claimed him. But something still pulled at him, a lingering sense that there was one last truth yet to be uncovered. The curse had been lifted, but the island remained. Its secrets, its ancient power, they were still here. And John couldn't leave, not yet. Not until he understood. As he walked, his body moving almost of its own accord, the jungle opened up before him, revealing a path he hadn't noticed before. It was as though the island itself was guiding him, leading him toward something hidden, something that had been waiting for him all along. The path twisted and turned through the dense foliage, the air growing cooler and heavier with each step. John's mind drifted, the memory of the sacrifice playing over and over in his thoughts. He had given himself to the island, but he had survived, at least physically. What did that mean? What was the true nature of the curse he had broken? He pushed deeper into the jungle, the path narrowing as the trees loomed higher, their branches intertwining overhead like the vaulted ceilings of a cathedral. The ground beneath him grew soft, the scent of damp earth filling his lungs. And then, through the thick undergrowth, he saw a stone doorway, half buried in the earth, its surface covered in the same ancient symbols he had seen throughout the island. John's heart pounded as he stepped closer, his pulse quickening despite the strange calm that had settled over him. This was at the heart of the island, the place where its power had been born. The final revelation. He hesitated at the threshold, his hand hovering just above the cold stone. The doorway seemed to pulse with energy, the air around it vibrating with a low hum. Something ancient, something powerful lay beyond. And whatever it was, it had been waiting for him. Taking a deep breath, John pushed the door open. The heavy stone groaned as it swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow passageway leading deep underground. The air inside was cool, the faint smell of decay lingering in the shadows. John stepped inside, his footsteps echoing softly against the walls as he descended into the darkness. The passageway was long, and the deeper John went, the more he felt the weight of the island's history pressing down on him. This place was old, far older than the settlers, older than the monolith, older than anything John had ever known. The very stones seemed to hum with ancient power, a reminder of the island's true nature. At last, the passageway opened into a vast underground chamber, illuminated by a strange, ethereal light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The chamber was massive, its ceiling lost in the shadows above. In the center stood a large stone platform, and on it, something that made John's breath catch in his throat. A body. It lay motionless on the stone, shrouded in tattered robes, its skin pale and withered. But this was no ordinary corpse. The figure's face, though gaunt and sunken, was disturbingly familiar. John stepped closer, his heart pounding as he peered into the hollow eyes of the figure before him. It was him. The realization hit John like a punch to the gut. The body lying on the stone was his own, or at least some twisted reflection of it. The features were unmistakable, the same jawline, the same build, even the same scar on the cheek. It was as if John were staring into a mirror, but the reflection was warped, corrupted. He staggered back, his mind reeling. How could this be? He had survived the sacrifice, he had broken the curse. So what was this? Was this the true price of the island's power? A voice, soft and low, echoed through the chamber, breaking the heavy silence. You are not the first. John spun around, his eyes wide with shock. In the shadows at the far end of the chamber, a figure stepped forward, draped in dark robes. His face was hidden beneath a hood, but there was something ancient, something knowing about him. Who are you? John demanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. What is this place? The figure approached slowly, his movements deliberate, his voice calm. I am the one who has watched over this island for centuries. I am the keeper of its secrets, the guardian of its power. John's chest tightened as he took a step back, the weight of the stranger's words settling over him. You're the one behind all of this, he said, his voice hardening. The curse, the sacrifices, it was you. The figure shook his head slowly. No. The island's power existed long before I arrived. I am merely its servant, its protector. The settlers, the sacrifices, they were part of the island's cycle, just as you are. John clenched his fists, anger bubbling to the surface. I broke the curse. I shattered the monolith. Why am I still here? Why is this happening to me? The stranger's gaze softened, and he stepped closer to John, his voice filled with an eerie calm. The curse was never truly about the monolith. It was about the island's power that has existed since the beginning of time. You broke the surface of that curse. Yes, but you did not sever the island's connection to you. John shook his head, his heart pounding in his chest. So what am I now? Why do I feel different? The figure gestured toward the body on the platform, the twisted reflection of John. You have become part of the island. Your soul is bound to its power, just as mine is. You are no longer just a man, you are its guardian, its keeper. John's stomach churned, the realization dawning on him like a weight crushing his chest. He wasn't free. He had never been free. The sacrifice had only sealed his fate. He had become one with the island, just as the settlers had before him, just as the stranger had. His soul was no longer his own. There must be a way out, John whispered, his voice trembling. There has to be. The stranger shook his head, his expression unreadable. The island does not release its chosen. You are bound to it now, for as long as it exists. You are its protector, its last line of defense. John's knees buckled, and he sank to the ground, his mind spinning. He had given everything to break the curse, to free the island and the souls trapped within it. But in doing so, he had become part of the very thing he had sought to destroy. The final revelation, the truth of the island, was far darker than he had ever imagined. The island had always demanded a guardian, someone to carry its power forward, to ensure its survival. The settlers had been a part of that cycle, but they had failed. John, by breaking the curse, had unknowingly accepted that role. He was the island's new guardian, its new keeper. The figure knelt beside him, placing a hand on John's shoulder. Do not fear what you have become. You have saved the island from its curse, and now you must protect it from the world. This place, its power, it is too dangerous to be unleashed. John closed his eyes, the weight of his fate crushing him. He had come to the island searching for answers, for a way to survive. But now he knew the truth. There was no escaping the island. He would be its final guardian, its eternal protector. And no one would ever know the price he had paid. The jungle whispered softly around him, the island's ancient power pulsing through the earth, through the stones, through John himself. The cycle was complete. Chapter 11, Escape or Doom. The chamber's oppressive silence weighed heavily on John Harper as the final revelation settled over him. The stranger's words echoed in his mind, an unshakable truth he could barely grasp. He was no longer just a man. The island had claimed him, just as it had claimed the settlers before him, binding him to its dark power. He was its new guardian, its last protector. But something inside John rebelled against the idea. He refused to accept that his fate was sealed, that his life would be spent serving this cursed island, guarding a power too ancient and terrible to understand. There had to be another way, another path. John slowly stood, his eyes locked on the stranger, who still hovered near the twisted reflection of John's body lying on the stone platform. The stranger's face remained hidden beneath the hood, his presence more ghostly than real. As though he had been a part of this island for so long that he was no longer entirely human. There must be a way to break the bond, John said, his voice quiet but filled with determination. There has to be a way to escape. The stranger's head tilted slightly, as if considering John's words. Escape? He repeated softly. There is no escape from the island's power. The moment you shattered the monolith, the island claimed you. Its energy flows through you now, just as it does through me. You cannot undo what has been done. John's hands clenched into fists, his heart pounding. He refused to believe that his life was now tied to this cursed place. That he was doomed to remain here forever, guarding a power he didn't understand. There has to be a way. John's voice grew more forceful, a spark of hope igniting in his chest. The settlers, something happened to them. They disappeared, but not all of them became those twisted creatures. Some must have escaped. What about them? The stranger's expression remained unreadable, his voice calm and measured. The settlers were lost. Some were consumed by the island's power, others fell to its madness. A few may have fled into the jungle, but they did not escape. The island always pulls you back. No matter how far you run, it will find you. John shook his head, his pulse quickening. Then why am I still here? Why haven't I turned into one of those creatures? Why hasn't the island completely taken me? The stranger fell silent for a moment. His gaze shifting toward the body on the platform, John's dark reflection, the twisted version of himself that lay motionless in the dim light. Because the island is not finished with you yet, the stranger finally said. It waits. It tests you, draws you deeper, until there is nothing left of who you were. John's chest tightened, but amidst the fear, a flicker of resolve ignited. He hadn't lost himself completely, not yet. He still had his mind, his will, his defiance. And that meant he still had a chance. He stepped closer to the stranger, his voice steady. What if I refuse? What if I fight the island's power? I shattered the monolith. What if I break something else? What if I break the island's hold on me? The stranger's expression remained unreadable, but a hint of something, perhaps doubt, flickered in his eyes. "If you try to defy the island," he said slowly, "it will fight back. It will make you pay the price for rejecting it." John squared his shoulders, his determination hardening. "Then let it fight." The stranger remained silent, his face hidden in the shadows of his hood. For a moment, the chamber seemed to pulse with a low, thrumming energy, as though the island itself were listening, waiting for John's next move. John turned away from the platform, his mind racing. There had to be something, some way to sever the bond between himself and the island. He had shattered the monolith, disrupted the curse, but the island's power still lingered, still clung to him. If he could find the source of that power, the heart of the island itself, perhaps he could destroy it, once and for all. He strode toward the far end of the chamber, his steps echoing off the stone walls. The passageway ahead led deeper underground, where the island's energy felt strongest. It was a risk, a dangerous one, but John knew he had no choice. If he didn't fight the island's pull now, he would lose himself forever. The stranger's voice called out behind him, soft and warning. "Harper, if you go down this path, there may be no return. The island will not let you go easily." John paused at the entrance to the dark passage, glancing back at the stranger. "I don't plan on coming back," he said, his voice steady. Without another word, John descended into the darkness. The passageway was narrow and winding, the walls lined with ancient carvings that glowed faintly in the dim light. The deeper John went, the stronger the island's presence became, pressing in on him from all sides. The whispers returned, faint at first, then growing louder, more insistent. As if the island knew what he was planning and was trying to stop him. But John pressed on, ignoring the voices in his head. He had come too far to turn back now. His only chance was to find the source of the island's power, the true heart of the curse, and destroy it before it consumed him completely. After what felt like hours of walking, the passage finally opened up into a vast underground chamber. The air was thick with a heavy, oppressive energy, and at the center of the chamber, a glowing pool of liquid pulsed with a dark, ethereal light. The heart of the island. John approached cautiously, his eyes fixed on the pool. The energy radiating from it was overwhelming, a force that seemed to pull at him, beckoning him closer. He could feel the island's power coursing through the air, through the very stone beneath his feet. This was at the source of the curse. The thing that had claimed the settlers, that had bound him to the island. The whispers grew louder, filling the chamber with their chaotic song. They pleaded with him, begged him to stop, to accept his fate and embrace the island's power. But John ignored them, his gaze locked on the glowing pool. He knew what he had to do. Without hesitation, John raised his spear and plunged it into the heart of the pool. The chamber erupted into chaos. A blinding light burst from the pool, and a deafening roar filled the air. The ground trembled beneath John's feet as the island's energy surged, lashing out in waves of raw power. John staggered back, barely able to keep his footing as the chamber shook violently. The whispers turned to screams, their voices filled with rage and pain as the island fought back. The energy in the air became suffocating, pressing down on John like a vice. His vision blurred, his body trembling as the island's power raged against him. But John held firm. He had made his choice. With a final, desperate surge of energy, the glowing pool erupted. In a flash of light, and the island's power was ripped apart, torn asunder by the force of John's defiance. The chamber fell silent. John collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The air was still, the oppressive energy gone. The island had been broken. He had won. But as he lay there, his body weak and trembling, a new realization dawned on him. The island's power was gone, but so was something else, something deep inside him. He felt empty, hollow, as though a piece of his very soul had been torn away. The island had taken its toll. John slowly pushed himself to his feet, his limbs heavy with exhaustion. He had broken the curse, severed the island's hold on him. But at what cost? He stumbled toward the passageway, his mind clouded with fatigue. The whispers were gone, the jungle silent. He had fought the island and won, but he knew he was no longer the same man who had washed ashore all those days ago. As he emerged from the underground chamber and stepped back into the light of the fading sun, John Harper looked out over the island one last time. He had escaped. But in doing so, he had lost something he could never recover. The island had claimed its final sacrifice. And though he had broken the curse, the cost had been his soul. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a thumbs up, and hit the notification bell so you never miss any of our new videos. Join us in our next video to explore the real-life journey of Alex, a story of survival, resilience, and self-discovery. Don't miss this inspiring adventure.